Hello, everybody. It's me, V, White Zulu, and welcome to another reading of my book, my autobiography of the same name. And I have a new chapter for you. And this one is called The Priest. I had left you with being punished severely or grounded effectively, for visiting somebody on the next door farm or leaving the farm boundaries. So, after more days of restlessly patrolling the boundaries, consumed by loneliness, I found myself on a hill overlooking the Mgeni Port Catholic Mission. I'll go down to the nuns and talk to Sister Anne, I decided. At least I hadn't been forbidden to go down there. I loved Sister Anne. She was a new novitiate whom I'd met on the road as I was riding home one afternoon. We often came across white nuns walking in pairs or threes, their hands folded in front of them, deep in prayer, as they took long walks along the dusty district road which runs below our house. We'd be on horseback, and they always nodded and smiled to us as we passed, and we knew they weren't allowed to speak. It was a retreat as well as a mission station, and, apart from the new, youngest nuns, older ones came for retreat from the main Catholic convent at Marion Hill, just outside of Durban. I'd seen her again when I'd ridden down to see Sister Theophane at the dairy. Sister Anne was helping her by carrying a 5-gallon can of cream up to the convent house. And she'd apparently been there long enough to be allowed to talk. She had the loveliest face with rosy cheeks, which was just about all I could see of her. She would have been possibly 19, maybe 20. The novitiates wore a sort of white cotton veil on a band which covered their hair, and shorter habits than the nuns, who wore full, flowing, ankle-length, snowy white robes and proper white wimples, which showed nothing but their faces. They all wore brown sandals over black socks, which looked rather odd, although Sister Theophane wore gumboots when it was wet. I had jumped off Rocket and was holding him by the reins when Sister Anne put her can down and came over to greet me and pat him on the neck. "Ah, sure, but he's a beautiful beast," she said in her sweet, lilting Irish accent. "What would you be calling him?" I gradually got to know her as I often rode down there, starved for company. She had come out from Ireland to become a nun. I wasn't particularly curious, as I'd always spent time with the nuns and didn't ask her any questions such as why did she want to become a nun in the first place. But she was a strikingly pretty and vivacious girl with sparkling green eyes and beautiful dark wavy hair, which kept escaping in wisps from under her veil. She had a delicious and very un-nun-like giggle, and a streak of tomboy in her, as I discovered when I got to know her a little better. She'd been in the Marion Hill convent for a year or so, and now she had to complete her second year in the back of Beyond out at the Mgeni Port Mission. "There's certainly no temptation out here," she'd say mischievously now and again. But apparently she wasn't so good at resisting enticement. As soon as she heard the clip-clop of my pony's hooves on the hard ground of the driveway approaching the convent, she'd run out from the kitchen or the dairy where she was working. "Come," she'd hiss conspiratorially in my ear as I dismounted, and we'd lead Rocket back down their drive and along the road which runs past the dairy towards Wakefield until we were out of sight of anyone from the convent. "Now, hold his head," and she tucked her habit up between her legs so that I could see that her black socks were actually long stockings. Put a sandaled toe into the stirrup and was up in the saddle in a flash. Grinning like an imp, she'd canter up the road while I sat on the bank and kept watch for any nuns who might come over the horizon. She'd come back eventually and hand the reins to me. "Ah, it reminds me of home," she'd sigh wistfully. "My brothers and I, we all rode the tinkers' ponies in the fields back there when we were young children." Today, as I trotted up the drive to the back of the convent, to where the clinic stood in the shade of some gum trees opposite the kitchen, there was no sign of Sister Anne. Must be in chapel or down at the dairy with Sister Theophane, I thought, and turned Rocket's head to go and find her. A young man came out of the gloom of the kitchen onto the back veranda. I'd never seen him before. "Hello," I called out cheerily to him. A nun popped out of the kitchen behind him. It was Sister Theophane. "Allô, ma petite," she smiled broadly at me. She always seemed pleased to see me, however busy she was. "This is Father Stevens," she introduced the man, who was probably about 20 years old. "He's up here to stay with us for a while." He was the equivalent of a novitiate priest. I don't know what the real term is for it. I discovered, in training to become a real priest. He had a boyish Mediterranean look, and I eyed him curiously. He wasn't wearing a dog collar like Father Tertius, but had on a silky sort of black shirt and black trousers. Father Tertius was the resident priest, and I only knew him vaguely. He had a grey beard and drove a Volkswagen Beetle at 100 miles an hour along our dirt roads. My father called him Holy Smoke and said darkly, "He's a bloody danger to the rest of us. One of these days, one of us is going to meet him on a blind rise, and that'll be that. Perhaps it'll be that doctor," he'd add with some satisfaction. Our GP, Dr. Potter, also drove at top speed, tearing along in the middle of the road with a great plume of brown dust flying from his wheels. "I've been meaning to come and see your father," the young man said to me. "I want to buy a horse so that I can ride out to places like Mbandla over the mountains there to extend the work of the mission." "I can help you buy a horse," I said with all the confidence of a then 9-year-old. After all, I knew everything there was to know about horseflesh from Grandpa. "I'll tell all the Zulus on the farm that you want a horse, and they can bring them down from a Mbandla for you to look at and choose one." My father didn't like priests of any kind, and he despised Catholics, and I knew for a fact he would have given this one short shrift. "Well, that seems like an easy solution," he replied, and that's exactly how he got his horse. It was a Basuto pony like Squib, but a bit taller, and with my help, Father Stevens looked it over carefully and took it out on a long ride with me beside him on Rocket, giving him advice before he bought it. We didn't want another squib with all his bad habits. To the convent every day after that, and I had to fit our rides in between the chapel and church services he held 3 times a day with Father Tertius for the nuns and the local Zulu women. Father Stevens would be waiting for me wearing blue denim jeans and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He'd be holding his pony Duma, all saddled up and ready, and we'd ride off together. I took him over to Wakefield, the farm beyond the nuns, and on which my father leased some extra grazing for our cattle. We had a Zulu caretaker called Velapi living in his kraal, hidden out of sight under the gum trees behind the main house, with some wives and lots of children, and I knew him well. Sawubona Nkosazana Wambapi. Where are you going? He'd call, and I'd wave back and ask him how his family was and whether there were any new calves I should see. I introduced my new companion as the new Umfundisi, meaning priest in Zulu. It actually translates to the one who can read. Father Stevens rode at my side as I took him further, through Wakefield and on to Stonycroft, the farm beyond. There were white people living there, but I didn't know them at all. They used the Dargle district road to get to places like Lions River and Howick, and we'd not be likely to come across them. They also had big dogs which raced towards us, barking madly, making Duma toss his head nervously and fidget at his bit. We'll avoid this lot, I said, and showed Father Stevens the single track which led up over the hills to Intlazan and Mbandla, the settlements where all our Zulus had their huts and families, and where they went when it was their time off. The only way there is on foot or on horseback, as the mountain pass is too narrow for a vehicle. Beyond Wakefield House, on the open green veldt, our path meandered round big sinkholes, where the stream coming off the mountains behind us had dived underground, causing subsidence. They appeared as great round deep holes lined with rich dark green moss, and out of which grew monster tree ferns, with their strange trunks covered in a unique brown, papery substance. Rare blue swallows nest under the mossy roofs of these cave-like holes, and appeared suddenly, as if by magic, from the long grass at our ponies' feet, the sunlight flashing off their cobalt blue backs as they shot out of their hidden subterranean nests. We could hear water trickling in little rills as the invisible stream continued its way to the river below. We talked as we rode over the veldt for hours and hours. Father Stevens came from an Italian background, which explained the olive complexion, although he was South African and had been born in Durban, as had I. He was very good looking, in an almost movie star way, with long dark eyelashes and hazel eyes. His hair was pitch black, thick and glossy, and he wore it slightly longer than any of the men I'd ever come across. He was very keen to learn as much as he could about horses and their behavior, and learned to ride very quickly. I liked him. He had a boyish enthusiasm about everything, especially as I began to point out various birds to him and taught him their Zulu names. He exclaimed with joy when I showed him where the weaver birds made their nests over what we called the judge's pool, and he saw the bright yellow birds popping in and out of their basket-like nests. He also enjoyed the red bishop birds with their scarlet heads and the wonderful sakabula birds, the red-shouldered widow birds with their long black tails, which trail behind them as they flutter about in their courtship displays. We rode together in this happy fashion for nearly 3 years. By the age of 11, trying to do the maths, but I can't. We rode, nearly 2 years. By the age of 11, I was semi-educated. I had read every book on the huge shelves, which covered almost every wall of the big old farmhouse, several of which were encyclopedias, and as a result had an extensive general knowledge. But I could only count up to 10, which was all that was required for sorting sheep with the herdsman. I counted in the Zulu fashion, using my fingers and thumbs. I still count that way. The name for thumb is ustupe, which is also the number 6 in Zulu. The other numbers up to 10 are the same names as the relevant fingers. None of the staff on the farm had ever been to school, and anyway, in old Zulu custom, there was never any need to count. Being originally cattle herding hunter-gatherers, they had few possessions as they used what was available around them in the bush and discarded the items such as bowls made from wood or leaves and rush baskets. Even their dwellings were simple wattle and daub huts with thatched roofs and could be left to dissolve back into the soil, to be reclaimed by nature. They took their animal skins with them for clothing and blankets, and of course their main source of wealth, cattle. They kept a careful tally of their precious stock of the rangy, big-horned zebu beasts, which they grazed over the veldt. These provided them with milk and meat, but, most importantly of all, were exchanged for new wives as lobola. But Zulus keep track of their cattle by their colours, and thus there are many different names for the colour brown in the Zulu language. Late one morning, as Father Stevens and I were riding back along the road towards the convent, I saw my father's Land Rover approaching from Wakefield. He drove slowly past us and glared at me as I sat on Rocket. He gave me his glittering, cold, cobra-eyed stare as the vehicle passed and completely ignored Father Stephen's polite greeting. "I see you've been riding out with that priest," he spat the word out. I'd been summoned yet again to the Glazine, where he and my mother were savouring their first pre-lunch gin. I braced myself for another tirade, but it never came. Instead, my father said abruptly, "It's a good thing you're going to St. Anne's in a week's time. That should put a stop to your shenanigans." This was the first I'd heard of these plans. While I'd been out roaming the hills with Father Stevens, my parents had received a phone call from St. Anne's Prep saying they suddenly had a vacancy as one of the girls had run away. My life was about to change, and it didn't sound promising. That's it for this time. More to come. Thank you so much, John, for all your hard work in making the time to create these videos with me. And if anybody wants more information, photographs, and about my work. I've got it all there. I've written several books. You can go to my website at www.whitezulubook.com. Thank you so much for listening, and goodbye.